Yes, Miss Scott.
Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can.
I've got a handful of questions to ask you from the call participants, so they'll dot about a bit.
Yes.
So we looked earlier at the Payment Review Group's recommendation on the cost of living with HIV and haemophilia from 1999. Was one done for the cost of living with HIV for infected partners, i.e. people that didn't have haemophilia?
Not to the best of my knowledge, no.
Do you know why not?
I don't, no.
We looked earlier at some of the different types of loans that Macfarlane Trust entered into with its registrants. We looked at the loans by exchange of letters. Do you know, or can you recall whether or not the registrants entering into those loans were advised to get legal advice?
I can't recall, but I think it unlikely.
And the same question for those registrants entering into loans secured by legal charge. Were they advised to get independent legal advice?
Again, not to my knowledge, in no way would they have been discouraged from doing so. And common sense would suggest that perhaps they should have.
I suppose to ask someone who is seeking a loan or an equity agreement on their house because they are short of money, to ask them to obtain independent legal advice might be to ask them to incur an expense at lawyers' rates. Presumably, the only way in which that could be achieved reasonably would be for the trust to fund the advice, would it not?
That is certainly one way, and it's not something that we would have refused funding for. They could also have gone to the Citizens Advice Bureau or to any free legal service that was available to them locally.
Yes. Thank you.
And do you have any recollection of funding such legal advice for anybody that entered into a loan?
No, I don't.
We looked at the Macfarlane Trust Handbook, which set out the details of the regular payment scheme and the single payment scheme, and provided information about procedures and how to make applications and what evidence would be required. Am I right in, is it right that the Eileen Trust did not have a similar publication?
No, I don't think they did. I think it is much more likely that by personal interview, either with the social worker, possibly with me, possibly with the benefits advisor, they would have been advised on the rates as soon as a need had been flagged up. It was a much more personal one-to-one relationship.
So is the answer to the question, why didn't they have a handbook, is the answer to that because they didn't need one because of the personal interaction?
Yes.
During your time at the Macfarlane Trust, do you recall whether widows were means tested to establish their eligibility for grants or payments?
Not if they were already eligible for those grants and payments.
So those categories that we looked at, the incapacitated widow, the widow with children, would not have been means tested for those the £100 per month that they got after the 6 months after bereavement. You were... Yes, you were explaining in your evidence earlier that the more proactive approach of the Eileen Trust in terms of offering support, anticipating the needs of its registrants, and the reason that you gave for that, or one of the reasons you gave for that, was the fact that the registrants had less support than the registrants at the Macfarlane Trust because they weren't associated with haemophilia centres and so on. What, if any, consideration was given to the support requirements for Macfarlane Trust registrants who were not attached to haemophilia centres, for example, infected partners, or indeed widows and dependents, or a person with haemophilia attached to a centre who didn't have a social worker or nurse who could assist with grant applications. So the question is, what consideration was given to the support requirements of those registrants by Macfarlane and to anticipate and assist them with obtaining appropriate funding from the Trust?
Obviously, we set up a number of groups which would have brought together those particular categories. We had opportunities for widows to meet, opportunities for infected intimates to meet, and we also, as far as I know, would have made it quite clear to an infected intimate widow that she would receive the same information as any other registrant of the Trust after her husband's death. You refer to people with haemophilia and HIV who were not attached to a haemophilia centre. If they were registered with the Trust, they would have received all the information that the Trust sent out to all its registrants. It wasn't just made available to them through the haemophilia centres, it was made available to them as individuals. If they missed out on information about, I cannot really think, but perhaps a particular new service that they should have heard about, I would like an opportunity to perhaps know what that might have been. But we certainly circulated all our registrants with the information, regardless of whether or not they were attached to a haemophilia centre and had a social worker. The Trust social worker would have helped such people to apply for funding from the Trust.
This morning, at the beginning of your evidence, you were giving evidence about the length of the perception within Macfarlane Trust that the Trust may only have a 2012 cut-off, or in that evidence you said that the perception was that the Trust would continue for the natural life of the registrants. Did you mean by that the primary beneficiaries, though people with haemophilia with HIV?
Yes, I think I did.
And what consideration do you understand was given by the trustees to the fact that even assuming that all of the people with haemophilia and HIV would have died within a certain period of time, given the life expectancy when Macfarlane Trust first came into being, what about the natural life of the dependents?
I'm only able to speak of what I was advised when I joined the Trust, which was that it had been set up as a trust that was not expected to last more than a certain number of years, and that there was an expectation that there would be no living registrants at the end of that time. I do not know whether, and I was never told whether there was any expectation of there being dependents of the trust who would require support for longer. I'm not sure that it had been addressed in those early days at all.
One of the things which I'm going to have to consider when I come to the stage of reporting is the terms upon which the trust was granted. You might like just to have a look at this as a matter of interest. And it's MACF 603_064. MACF 6 zeros and then 3_064. And can we go to paragraph or clause 4 of the trust deed, please, Sumik? Try page 3 or 4. Next page. If we look at clause 4, I don't know if you ever had your attention drawn specifically to this, but this is the trust deed, and this is the part which sets out what the trust is for. And it says to me, admittedly I'm taking a lawyer's approach to this, that the objects for which the trust is established are to relieve those persons suffering from haemophilia who, as a result of receiving infected blood products in the United Kingdom, are suffering from acquired immune deficiency syndrome or are infected with HIV, and who are in need of assistance. Or, and this is the bit, or the needy spouses, parents, children, and other dependents of such persons, i.e. of people who've been infected with HIV through blood products, and the needy spouses, parents, children, or other dependents of such persons who have died. Anyone who had regard to that, I would have thought, in drafting it, must have had in mind that if someone in their early middle age died, leaving children and dependents, that might go on for very much longer than the period of time that you're telling us about. But that view was not reflected in anything you heard from what you're telling us.
No, I don't think it was. No, I think my understanding, which may have been deficient, was that the trust as such was not expected to be a long-lived trust.
Yes.
That could have just been the opinion of the people who spoke to me at the time. But that is what they told me at the beginning.
And presumably that view was something which affected the way in which the trust conducted itself and thought it should conduct itself.
Well, at the time that I joined, it was just after combination therapies were proving very successful, and it was becoming clear that the lifespan of the primary beneficiaries was likely to be uncertain, but longer than had been expected when the trust was set up.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Did the Macfarlane Trust consider it to be within its remit to provide funds for the needs of its registrants which arose from hepatitis C as well as HIV?
As I think it's stated in the paperwork provided, the trust regarded a registrant of the trust as being the whole person, and that any other accompanying a physical illness or disability was included in their response to the needs of that person.
You said in your evidence earlier this afternoon that applications for special payments required support from social workers or OTs or other medical professionals who would identify the need for that single payment.
Yes, it is a single, it's not a special payment.
Sorry, yes,
it's a
single payment, sorry,
yes.
yeah, single payment. Given that this required registrants to approach the very medical professionals at the very centre where they had been infected with HIV, did the Macfarlane Trust give any consideration to that fact that in effect it made those who were responsible for the infections the gatekeepers to the single payments, and that may act as a deterrent to applications being made?
I don't think it ever occurred to us that we would ask for independent medical information about one of the registrants. Whether or not the registrants felt deterred from asking for grants from the trust because there would be medical information sought from the centre which had been responsible for the treatment which had led to their infection, I don't know.
Were any efforts made to ensure representation on the partnership group or amongst user trustees from the devolved nations, so Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland?
I don't believe so, not necessarily, no. In Scotland, the Haemophilia Society was a completely separate charity under different charity rules. In Wales, I don't think at that point it was a devolved country. And in Northern Ireland, certainly in my role, I regarded Northern Ireland as part of the area that we were responsible for, as I did with Wales. Whether or not the trustee board felt the necessity to have representation from each of those countries, I am unaware.
When you were having meetings with the government, if I can put it like that, were they meetings simply with the Department of Health, or do you recall having any meetings or any interactions with the Scottish Executive after 1999?
The only occasion I ever recall meeting anyone from the Scottish Executive would have been when I was a Haemophilia Society trustee and went up to visit. So no.
I asked you about emails referring that passed between Peter Stevens and Gordon Clark earlier. Another phrase that emerged from emails between trustees was whinging hemos. Do you recall hearing or seeing in written communications anybody using that phrase?
No, I don't. And if I had, I should have recorded it as something that I felt was totally wrong and inappropriate.
And do you recall attending any meetings to discuss the use of derogatory or disparaging terminology used about registrants and the beneficiary community?
No, I don't.
And do you recall hearing of or witnessing firsthand trustees or staff members referring to members of the beneficiary community in derogatory terms?
No. No, I don't.
those were all of the questions, sir.
Thank you. Not long ago, in this inquiry, well, let me begin actually in this way. You've spent most of your life, have you, in well, working life, that is, in the charitable sector.
Yes.
And before you worked for the Macfarlane Trust and the Eileen Trust, from what you've said earlier, you were working, I think, essentially with charities which provided services.
Yes.
The difference between those sorts of charities and indeed the Haemophilia Society itself is that the principal role of the Macfarlane Trust, and for that matter the Eileen Trust, was as a grant-making charity. Am I right?
Yes.
So was that a new experience for you?
No, we had given grants when I was at, through the Blue Peter Fund, in fact, when I was at what was then the Spastic Society. We had certainly fundraised and sought grants when I was at St. Christopher's Fellowship. So that, no, it was not an entirely new experience, but what was new was the source of funding was from one source only, and that the community, the beneficiary community, was very specific.
We heard a view expressed not long ago in this inquiry that if one had a list, a tariff list, if you like, of so much for such and such a piece of equipment, just as in the office guidelines, and if it were published to those who were registrants or beneficiaries, that inevitably, people being people, so the view went, that they would seek something which was of the maximum value to the top of the range for which allowance was being made. Would that have been your view of this particular community?
No, definitely not. First of all, the recommendations for grants came after careful assessment, either by the Trust's social worker or the social worker at a centre, or even a local authority social worker, who would assess the need. There wouldn't be a question of people necessarily just wanting the most expensive thing on the list. I don't regard anyone ever regarding that simply as a shopping list.
Did you ever see any reason to distrust, in the main, at any rate, the applications made to the charity for a grant?
No.
You took the job, I imagine, at Macfarlane because you hoped that you would find fulfillment, personal fulfillment, in occupying that role in that charity for a period of time. Am I right?
You are right, yes.
And did you?
Yes, very much so.
And is that why you then, or why at about that time you then went on to become a trustee voluntarily, not unpaid,
Yes.
Of the Haemophilia Society itself?
Yes.
As a matter of interest, had you known Karen Pappenheim from her work in charities prior to your taking up the role with the Macfarlane Trust?
No, I hadn't. No.
The difference between the Haemophilia Society and its charitable activities and that of the Macfarlane Trust may perhaps have been that the Haemophilia Society felt free to, indeed it felt it's partly its job to, campaign for better treatment by government of those who had suffered from infected blood products, as well as campaigning in other respects for the general benefit of those who had the condition of haemophilia. That campaigning aspect was broadly absent, was it, from the Macfarlane Trust?
It was entirely absent. I was certainly told on my very first interview with the trustees that this was a campaigning body, that the fund, we were administering the fund on behalf of government, and that no liability had ever been admitted by government, and our role was very specifically to administer the funds for the benefit of the trust of the beneficiary group.
Had that approach, the approach of campaigning for the beneficiary group, been an approach which some of your earlier charities had taken on behalf of their particular communities?
And what, not to campaign?
To campaign.
To campaign, yes, the previous charities certainly were campaigning. I mean, we had a campaigns department at the Spastic Society, which is now Scope, and we regularly campaigned on the part of homeless young people when I was at St Christopher's. So yes, campaigning was part of my previous existence.
So a further distinction, perhaps, between the Macfarlane Trust as a charity and the other charities with which you had association both before and after your work for Macfarlane was that they did not feel at all constrained in campaigning on behalf of those whom they served.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much.
So I've just got two further questions that have been handed to me, if I may.
You won't mind. Please go ahead.
The first one is in relation to the childless widow. So the childless widow, the cohort of widows whose support stops after 15 months. Was there any scope for such a widow who subsequently becomes unwell to apply back to the Macfarlane Trust to receive support? So she becomes an incapacitated widow after having her support stopped. Was there any scope for her to apply back in those circumstances?
She could certainly have applied back. Whether or not she would have been recognised as an incapacitated widow who would need continuing support would have been an individual judgment of the trustee board at that time.
And are you aware of any steps taken to ensure that widows were aware that they could do so?
No. Apart from keeping in touch with them and through the bereavement project in particular, we probably would not have known. If they wanted to remain in touch with the Macfarlane Trust, they probably could have done so, but I'm not quite sure what would have been the main avenue for them to keep connected, as it were.
So there wasn't a route that springs to mind.
No.
For them to keep in touch. Was the we spoke about the Macfarlane Trust handbook, and you in your evidence said that it was sent out every year to the registrants. Was it also sent to widows?
Certainly if they were infected intimates. I'm not aware of whether we sent it out to all the widows. At this distance of time, I can't recall.
Those are the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Now, is there anything that you would like to say? Feel free.
Yes.
You can take as long as you like.
It's a particular area over which I felt concern when I was working at the Trust, and have felt continuing concern, and it is one that I don't believe was addressed, as far as I know, by trustees in my time, and I don't know subsequently. It is to do with the area of life insurance. Now, I mean, as you will be aware, anyone who is infected with HIV has, since the inception of the recognition of HIV, has been unable to get life insurance. What I think we failed to recognize was that for almost all mortgages, life insurance is a requirement. Now, I know that Susan Daniels was able to obtain mortgages for people with HIV and haemophilia through connections. And I know that at the time, certainly when I was there, possibly previously, the issue of life insurance was never really addressed. But in most people's situation, when they are a couple and one of them dies, the life insurance that has been attached to the mortgage would be payable to release the partner from the incumbency of the mortgage. I don't believe that government ever recognised the difference for people who had been infected with HIV through their treatment, and what a major difference this would make in the lives of their widows and partners. I believe it is an area that should be addressed, and if one looks at the differences between those people living with HIV and haemophilia, or indeed not, but just with HIV, that they have received through their treatment, I believe that it's never been recognised that one of the major ways in which their life was changed forever was the lack of life insurance. And I believe that there is scope to recommend that this situation be examined, and that the possibility of recognising what would have been available to widows at death of their partner, had there been life insurance in place, it should be recognised as something which could actually be paid, if you like. I think that's particularly important where people have been living with the results of having had a charge or an equity loan or something else on their property for many years. And obviously I'm talking in particular about one lady, but not only her. I believe that the whole issue of life insurance was not looked at by the trustees, by government, to the best of my knowledge, and that the deficit in the lives of people was not recognised because it wasn't looked at. Some questions are too difficult to look at.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you very much for being prepared to give us your evidence and your insight, and give us another view of the way in which the Macfarlane Trust operated, albeit a period, in your case, of some 7 years, from 1997 to 2003. I think, to me, if I may say so, what encapsulated a lot of your approach is summed up in a phrase which you used about the user or registrant trustees, which was that they might be more clearly give a more clearly understanding view of the needs of beneficiaries. And I think that's just an example of what seemed to me to be evidence full of gentle and kind difference rather than criticism from the views of others. Well, I've heard what might be said to be the underlying criticism, and I've noted it. And I've noted in particular the courteous way in which you've expressed it, and I want to thank you for all that, and for the insight which you've given us. That is where we finish for tonight. I just have to tell or ask Miss Scott, I think I already know what we're doing tomorrow, but it's your role to tell everyone, Miss
Yes.
Scott.
Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Christopher Fitzgerald is coming to give evidence.
So 10 o'clock tomorrow. Until then, thank you very much.
Thank you.